The effectiveness of AML policies, transaction reporting. I'm very happy to welcome you to have this debate with, I think, 5 very knowledgeable experts on the subject. And the intention was this morning to do it a bit the other way around, not to start with the regulators or the supervisors, but to start with the bankers, how they deal on a day-to-day basis with transaction monitoring, compliance with AML rules. And I think, this webinar is well planned. We read about this again yesterday, some issues in the Netherlands, a big court case, settlement, but as well, let's say, in Denmark, the issue is simmering on, let's say, so it's not yet over, and we'll continue to hear about this. I also have Richard, who's the co-author of our AML report, which we published in the month of January, who will be moderating this webinar with me. I will do the first half, then Richard will take over in the Q&A with the different speakers, but also respond to the questions and answers which we've got in the Q&A box at the bottom. So for all of you, if you want to raise questions after or during the talks from the different speakers, you can use the Q&A. We will look at this and try to respond to this, but also Richard will take that over in the second part of the webinar, raise the questions with the different speakers depending to whom it is addressed. If you also probably indicate to whom you want to address a question. As I said, I'm very happy. Let's say we have an excellent group of speakers. We have 2 bankers which are involved on a day-to-day basis in applying the AML rules. We have Mark from HSBC and Matthew from Nordea, 2 large cross-border banks, looking at it from their perspective. Then we'll look at Caroline Gardner, well known, who's working on coordinating the AML work with an EBA, who will react from her perspective on what she heard from the bankers. Then we'll ask Ilse, who's the head of the Latvian FIU, to react on it from an FIU perspective. And then we have James Stroman from Google, who will say what can technology providers do to facilitate transaction monitoring. And then we'll have a Q&A. So without further ado, I pass the floor to Mark, who will kick it off and say how he's doing this in HSBC on a day-to-day basis. Mark, welcome, and thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Carel. Thanks very much for the invitation, and also to those who've turned up to listen to what we have to say. I'm only going to talk for 5 to 6 minutes on transaction monitoring, and then there'll be obviously questions towards the end, which I look forward to. I'll kick off with definitions and then get into what we actually do, and then some of the areas that we're looking how we can make it more effectiveness and what might help with that. When I talk about effectiveness, I'm not actually looking at the AML regime that we've introduced to by itself decrease the amount of crime that's in the world. That would be nice to have, but I think my definition of what effective looks like is, are we able collectively to make it more difficult for criminals to use the financial system to launder funds? Now, when you get towards your questions, you can sort of pick holes in my definition, because I know that it's quite ropey, and there are other ways of defining it. TM, transaction monitoring, by definition for me, is the automated deployment of technology to automate the monitoring of our customers. And that's quite important, because we have other ways that we monitor our customers. But when I talk about transaction monitoring, I'm really talking about that use of technology to automate that monitoring. So on a scale, large volume and value of transactions globally for both our customers and also non-customer transactions through the correspondent network. And that's quite an important definition, because when we're talking with regulators and supervisors, we sometimes get lost in that difference between automation and manual monitoring of our customers. The third thing I'll bring out is just recognition that these obligations for this large scale automated monitoring of customers haven't been around forever. It evolved from the original 1989 recommendation from the Financial Action Task Force, which was to keep an eye out for, essentially, or be mindful for large transactions and unusual patterns of behavior. And that then, over the course of the 1990s, morphed its way into what we have today. So by the early 2000s, the advent of new technologies for payments and new technologies for monitoring those payments evolved to this use of large-scale automated capabilities. And when I put that in perspective from what I do as the person accountable for the end-to-end transaction monitoring for HSBC, that equates to millions and millions of customers, let's say nearly 50 million transacting customers. But at a payment level, it's nearly 7 billion transactions per month that we will monitor. And in order to do that, we have hundreds of staff working on our technology pieces and literally thousands of staff who are looking at the output of that process. So the alerts that these technologies generate, and then as that distills down the various investigations that we need to conduct to satisfy ourselves as to whether there's financial crime present or not, and then report that to the appropriate authorities depending on the jurisdiction we're in. And having distilled all of that down even further, we get to the point where if we're successful, just under 2,000 occasions per month will notify those authorities that we believe this customer or this non-customer, pseudo-customer of ours is actually engaged in financial crime. So when you start out with 7 billion all the way down to a couple of thousand cases where we believe there is financial crime present, you can look at, from our perspective, it's very important to get the efficiencies right, because otherwise it can cost you an awful lot of money, and it does. But also the effectiveness. I mean, how do we make sure that what we are reporting is all the financial crime we can identify with the technology at our disposal? So that balance between effectiveness and efficiency is what occupies my day. And if I put that into perspective, if we don't get it right in some jurisdictions where we invest in a lot of technology and we don't get a lot of return on that technology, the cost per SAR, so for each one of those reports we submit to the government agencies, can be as much as a small family car. So it's quite an incentive for us to actually tune that to actually get that right. So the first thing we'll talk about there is, when we talk about effectiveness, how we get it right. Transaction monitoring is really a rule-based system where, based on a series of typologies that we believe represent financial crime, we break those down into rules. We code those rules into our system, and we run our transactional profiles against those rules based on whether the customer is more or less likely to engage in anomalous behavior that the machines will detect. Now, having done that, we are essentially looking for the problems or the anomalies in how the customers interact. Now, of course, the problem with that when it comes to effectiveness is any decent criminal, and there are quite a lot of stupid criminals out there, but any decent criminal already knows what we're looking for, because they're quite well publicized, they're quite well categorized. You can actually search for them on Google, believe it or not. So they spend a lot of their time trying very hard to not look like a criminal and to look like a normal customer. So it's very, very difficult then for us to determine whether that's an anomaly, whether it's an anomalous transaction, whether it is a criminal, or whether it's simply somebody who's a little bit weird in how they use our bank. That happens globally, and we see that in almost every jurisdiction. We see that in almost every type of bank we interact with. So it's not just something that our bank has had. So how we get better at those sorts of things? We can do it more efficient and more effective. The effectiveness, we are deploying new technologies. So we're still involved in this arms race that started back in the late 1990s of deploying new technologies to get better at it. So things like machine learning, artificial intelligence, the ability to process more data by putting everything into the cloud. These are all techniques that we invest in to improve our effectiveness, to get better at detecting those anomalies, those anomalous transactions, and picking where the customers are trying to look like a normal customer, in actual fact, they're criminal operations. And the use of those new technologies is more effective. It is quite a bit more effective when you deploy it correctly in determining whether it's a criminal or a non-criminal in our customer base. They are, of course, quite expensive. So the ability to deploy those, and something that I'm sure will come up as part of the debate, as a large global bank, we have an economy of scale that we're able to deploy. When you talk about some of the smaller tier 2 and tier 3 banks internationally who still have a cross-border obligation, their ability to afford the same technology is quite limited. So we run into situations where we're talking to them about some of their customers and they're not aware that their customers are actually criminal operations because they haven't been able to detect it. And this is where the relationship with law enforcement and some of the agencies becomes quite important. And I'm sure that will come up in questions as well. And the final thing we'll do, I'm aware of the time that I've been talking. The final thing that we do is when we look at how the industry is evolving. I'm a big fan of the PPPs, the public-private partnerships, and we get a lot of value from that in the use of intelligence to detect where the criminals are likely to operate. I'm also a big fan of the utility models that I'm starting to see develop, particularly through Europe, where there's a lot of collaboration and partnership between the private sector. I would like to combine those two, where our utility models are more in partnership with the public sector to assist in the detection, particularly for those tier 2 and 3 banks who can't necessarily afford the scale operations that the larger global banks can. So I'm going to pause there. I'll hand over to Matthew, who's going to be talking next, and I look forward to the questions.
Thank you very much, Mark. Matthew, yes?
Thanks very much, Mark, for those insights, and thank you, Carol. Thank you, CEPS, for the invitation. Thanks particularly for the very thoughtful task force work you've done. It's an excellent paper, very well timed, such a good contribution. Congratulations to you and to Richard and to everyone who was involved with that. Let me start by first of all saying, I think, an important thing to acknowledge that the banking sector has been found wanting in terms of and ineffective compared to the size and complexity of this problem. And I include my own bank in that category. But I think we also have to be honest, and I think the CEPS report does, is to realize that the public authorities have also been found to be ineffective, and that the regulatory framework itself has been found to be ineffective too. And you know, the fact that the report you've published has this, you know, fact that the European firms are spending more than 110 billion euros every year on AML compliance, but only 1.1% of the proceeds of crime are confiscated. That illustrates this system is not working at all. And transaction monitoring is a big part of the problem. I'll come back to that. And you might have spotted as well in the more popular media, last week, The Economist had a thoughtful analysis of financial crime, and their conclusion was that this system is, quote, hugely expensive and largely ineffective. And it's hard to disagree with that. So what are the reforms we need? And then maybe talk about transaction monitoring in the context of these. I say there's 3 key elements. The first one is, I think the public authorities in this area need to be much better resourced and better coordinated. And to my mind, that argues in favor of the Commission proposals out any day now, I think, to say we should have an EU AML authority and for strengthening, supporting, coordinating the FRUs. There's lots of reasons for this. The resources is important, as I've said. I think the smaller member states get outgunned by the criminals. That's part of the problem. But more fundamentally, as we know, this is an international problem. Payments cross borders. It's very hard to see this in a fragmented silo approach. We need this in a more joined up way. I also think there's an opportunity, and I know focus is on transaction monitoring, but maybe we'll get into KYC a bit, Carol, to make the KYC rules simpler, to stop corporates multiply doing KYC in different formats all across their different jurisdictions that they work in. And maybe for me to be a little provocative, half true, half untrue, is to say, I think until we have a credible EU authority in place, the de facto regulator in Europe is the US, and for all of the EU banks, until we get a stronger European approach to this. But I think an EU authority is not enough. And I think you make this point quite clearly in the CEPS report, Carol and Richard. And I think if we just think we create a new authority to use the exact same way we're using transaction monitoring, more supervision, more tick box compliance, it's not going to work. We need to have some new elements. I think first and foremost, we need to have better use of technology and data. That's super important. And we also need, crucially, and Mark mentioned this at the end there, have better public-private collaboration. I think this is an essential ingredient. And let's take some facts on transaction monitoring to illustrate the point. And first, I should say another great thing about the CEPS paper is you actually point out for such an important part of public policy, it's very data light. And there aren't many good metrics or KRIs, so bringing some facts to bear is really valuable. You said in the report that there's 1.1 million SARs a year, 10% of those get investigated. I think that's probably optimistic. I suspect it's not as many as 10%, but I might be wrong. I know in one Nordic country, I'm not going to name the Nordic country, they get 75,000 SARs a year to their FIU, and they have 32 people dedicated to handling them. So that's 2,200 SARs per person. If you do your maths there, that's a lot to be processed and handled. So then let's go upstream to the transaction monitoring by the banks, which is what Mark's been talking about. How are we feeding this this engine of the FIUs, which are under-resourced, I think, and fragmented? Well, we also have some unpleasant data to bring to bear. As Mark said, he's got thousands of people manually processing alerts. I was trying to add it up in my head. Maybe you and Richard would know. There's probably tens of thousands of people across the world in manual jobs taking alerts and figuring out are they SARs or not. Why do they have to do that? Because we have a 98% false positive rate. 98%. So out of these alerts, that's maybe 95% of the alerts that you heard from, those billions of transactions that Mark does per month, the billions we do a year because we're smaller. We get all these alerts. We have to sift through them all with human beings, and then they generate the SARs, which then feed into the overwhelmed FIUs. I think it is just not a very effective part of financial regulation. That makes the point for better resources, I think, for better use of data and technology, and I think for better collaboration. As Mark mentioned, I endorse this. The UK, where I used to work, used to be a regulator, has this model they call the Joint Money Laundering Intelligence Task Force. So you have banks, you have regulators, you have law enforcement officials working collaboratively. The barriers to data sharing are torn down. You navigate your GDPR issues to make those things work. And you have targeted transaction monitoring, you have intelligence-led activities. We've also been part of a pilot scheme in Sweden to have a Samlet to do the same thing, where we have agreement that the Swedish police can share names of criminals with us and we can target our activities. We're also working with the Finnish authorities to do targeted activities as well. So I think you can envisage a better European approach. Imagine you have a new AML authority, you have better resources, better coordination for the FIUs. You've got a partnership with the banks. You have targeted transaction monitoring, not this scattergun approach. We're using artificial intelligence, network analysis, where we're refining down and we're identifying actual criminals. We're confiscating assets. We're getting arrests. I think that is a possible vision. It's a difficult area. It's a complex area. The banks and the public authorities, we're gonna not get everything right all the time, but we can do much better. I think the Commission's proposals are part of the solution, but we also need to leverage technology, and we also need better public-private collaboration. I think that's essential, and I think the CEPS report is a great set of recommendations to influence the EU debate.
Thanks a lot, Matthew. Very insightful, very interesting, but at the same time, you indicate there is a lot of issues to be improved. And of course, we hope, let's say, that will be addressed at least partially in what is coming up from the Commission in a few weeks. We are all curious. Carolyn, a lot to react upon from your side, because we know that in the ESA review, EBA has been given a additional task in the AML domain, which was since the beginning of last year, if I can remember correctly. So how do you look at this from your perspective? Know that you've been, a bit more than a year in this position, I think.
Thank you very much, Carol. And indeed, the EBA has for a bit more than a year now been in charge of leading, coordinating and monitoring the EU financial sector's fight against financial crime. And that sounds very grand, but essentially what it means that it's a little bit of a step up from the regime that we had in place previously, where essentially the European supervisory authorities' AML CFT mandates were spread across the 3 European supervisory authorities and focused very specifically on the implementation of the anti-money laundering directive. And what we're doing now that we've got new powers and a new legal AML CFT mandate, is we look at AML CFT or money laundering and terrorist financing risk really across the board, and not just in the context of AML CFT supervision and the things that financial institutions should do to comply, but also, for example, in the context of prudential work. So we're looking at money laundering and terrorist financing risk in the context of authorizations. We're looking at it during ongoing prudential supervision, and we look at it in the context of what happens when a financial institution has to be resolved. So it's really looking at things across all stages of a financial institution's life cycle and across all parts of supervision. And this is really quite a significant change from what happened previously, which we think contributed to some of the big money laundering and terrorist financing scandals that we've seen in the EU, where essentially everyone, every supervisor, every public authority, every institution did their own thing to comply, but didn't necessarily exchange information and work together. And this is, I think, the point that I want to focus on here, because listening to what Matthew said and listening to what Mark said, I think one common theme is that we need to get much better at cooperation and at exchanging information in the private sector, between the private sector and the public sector, and also in amongst public sector authorities, because we're operating under a risk-based approach to anti-money laundering and terrorist financing, and a risk-based approach means that it's only going to be as effective as the information that you put in. So if you have good information that you can use and sufficient information to inform your approach, then chances are that you're going to be much better at detecting and preventing money laundering and terrorist financing. And so here, in the EU, I think we've got 2 main challenges. One is a cultural challenge, and the other is a legal challenge. And if I look perhaps first at the cultural challenge and looking at it predominantly from the public sector perspective, because I think we've covered the private sector. So just to give you an example, we carry out reviews of competent authorities' approaches to the anti-money laundering and counter-terrorist financing supervision of banks. And these implementation reviews are a little bit like an FATF mutual evaluation, but they focus very specifically on what supervisors do to ensure that the financial sector complies with their AML CFT obligation and complies effectively. And when we go on site, we speak not just to the supervisor, but we also speak to other stakeholders, including the financial intelligence unit. And one thing that really strikes me is how little cooperation and information exchange is happening in practice, even at the level of individual member states. For example, we often hear from the supervisor that the FIU cannot exchange information in respect of financial institutions, systems and controls, or individual actors. And then we go to the FIU, who tells us, yes, they can exchange information, but the supervisor never asks. So here we've got two key actors in a member state's AML CFT regime, who each hold information that is really relevant for the other one, but they don't exchange that information, even though legally it should be possible. It's just that no one asks, no one exchanges, and that's a really, really big shortcoming in our current approach, and not one that is necessarily due to legal obstacles. And it's a shame, because there's really a lot to be gained from that information exchange. And looking just at what supervisors, for example, would benefit from, it's to understand, for example, from the FIU, whether a financial institution's STRs are of a sufficient quality, or how perhaps the level of reporting compares with that of the financial institution's peers, or maybe even if the financial institution has been named in STRs submitted by other financial institutions. So these are all things that would be really valuable for a supervisor to have, and would enable them to have much more targeted and effective supervision. But it's information that they don't necessarily have access to. Another example, I think, relates to cooperation between supervisors. And here we are starting to see a little bit of a shift in attitudes and an increase in supervisory cooperation. And it's historically, AML supervisors have not cooperated with one another very much, and also not with prudential supervisors. And that's probably because in the anti-money laundering directive, we've got not only a minimum harmonization approach, which is much talked about, but we've also got the territoriality principle, which essentially means that supervisors, AML supervisors, are responsible for making sure that financial institutions comply with the AML regime in their member state. And so historically, there has been a perception of a lesser need to cooperate with other AML supervisors. But we've seen very, very clearly in the last few years that this no longer works, and that of course financial crime doesn't respect borders. So it's really important, especially if you're supervising a cross-border group, that you exchange information with your counterparts that are responsible for the AML supervision of entities of the same group in other member states and elsewhere in the world. And so we put in place so-called AML colleges, which are really making a big difference. But it's not just that. It's about making sure that as supervisors, you exchange information with one another in order to have the best information possible about the financial institution. And to just give you an example of one recent college that we attended, an AML college that we attended, we found that there was one host supervisor who had identified problems with the financial institution's transaction monitoring system, and brought this to the attention of college members who are supervisors as well. And based on this information, other supervisors were then able to go into the group, into the part of the group that they were responsible for supervising, to check whether those issues existed as well in their member state, and they could take action to rectify those shortcomings in good time and before the risks really had crystallized. So it's just an example of how cooperation and information exchange is really, really important. It's important for good supervision, it's important for preventing money laundering, and it's important to strengthen the AML CFT systems and controls also in financial institutions. But it's not happening consistently across the board just yet. And in addition to the cultural change, in addition to highlighting how it's important to exchange information, what we think is there needs to be a change at the level one as well, in order to be clear about which information can be exchanged, who it can be exchanged with, and generally what's possible in that space. And so there are questions about the extent to which information can be exchanged within a group. And I think this is something that Mark alluded to, in particular where parts of the group are located outside the EU. There are questions about the extent to which information can be shared with others outside of the group through, for example, data pooling initiatives. There are questions for supervisors in relation to sharing information about their assessments of fitness and propriety, for example, or also closer to the EBA's home, about the type of information that can be fed into the future central EU database, EU AML database that the EBA is setting up. But all of this really boils down to the need to clarify at union level how AML CFT interacts with data protection rules and requirements. And here the key, or one of the keys, seems to be that we need a common understanding really of the way that personal data can be processed and shared in a way that is compliant with the EU's data protection framework. And to complement that, it would also be really important to be clear that there are legal gateways to exchange information with all relevant authorities and entities. And here I would just like to give the example of deposit guarantee schemes and the need for FIUs and supervisors to also to be able to exchange information with those. So as we're moving into a space where information exchange is hopefully going to be the norm and not just an afterthought as it has been for too long, it's really important that everyone is clear where they stand and that the legal basis is clear and that it's interpreted consistently across the EU. And a last point, and then I'll stop. When talking about legal change or clarifying the legislative framework in this regard, we think it's really important to think about whether this can be set out in a regulation, because what we've seen with a directive-based approach is that transposition at the national level can vary. There's inconsistent interpretations of what different rules mean in different member states. And finally, of course, transposition means that there is a need to act at the level of the member state for laws to take effect. And to this date, it's impossible for some supervisors to share information with others because the fifth directive hasn't been transposed. So if we manage to set or if the Commission manages to set things out in a regulation that is directly applicable, we think that would be a very useful development. I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Caroline. Quite a lot of things to be done by regulators to make it work, and probably as a question to Ilse to start kick it off. Even within the member states, Caroline said, there is no cooperation or there is insufficient exchange of information. Ilse, how do you look at this from your perspective, from as head of the FIU in Latvia? And thanks for joining us.
Yeah, good morning, everybody. Very nice to be in your company. So very honored to be invited to speak here. Of course, I would certainly, I need to say that one of the conclusions of the report of CEPS was that the bottleneck, the real bottleneck for the AML, effective AML system is FIU. And not a big surprise that I would certainly disagree to that conclusion. Of course, I can see that there are some issues that still need to be resolved on EU and FIU level, but I think that this report and basically what we have heard here kind of very nicely illustrates that there is a lack of common understanding also at the EU level about the role and the task of FIU. I think that we need to understand not only here, but also on a broader level that FIU is just a one chain in different between different actors and different institutions, and we have one and very specific responsibility and role. And it is a big mistake to connect the amount of confiscations of criminal money to FIU. I think it needs to be established and very clearly announced that this is the role of law enforcement. And the question is, how come that it is so poorly enforced by the law enforcement and prosecutors and judiciary, the information that has been provided by FIUs to them? This is one aspect there. And I think that in order to explain my understanding of the issues there in AML system and on an EU level, I need to kind of like explain also my background. I'm not coming from FIU entirely. I joined FIU just almost 3 years ago. Months later, there will be 3 years anniversary when I joined FIU. Before that, for 20 years, I was working in the private sector. I was a partner with Deloitte, and then I was for 20 years attorney at law. So practically, I would say I understand what are the issues in the private sector, in the public sector, as well as I'm a lecturer in university, so from academic point of view as well. So from that perspective, I think that what is the problem here is that, and basically it also explains why I represent FIU right now at this stage. Caroline also already indicated that there were certain banking scandals on an EU level. And of course, it's not kind of like a big secret to anybody that one of the banking scandals that were kind of like initiating discussion and debate on EU level was ABLV Bank, which of course was a huge scandal, not only for Latvia, but also for the whole EU AML system. And that was the main reason why I decided to shift from private sector to public sector and really to do something good, if I may say so, in order to improve AML CFT system here in Latvia. And what I can say from my personal experience, also leading not only FIU, but also leading delegation to Moneyval and FATF in the very, very difficult process of getting out of potentially being graylisted by FATF, I may say that there are certain elements that I really appreciate that the EU has raised that in its initiative last year by publishing action plan. There are certain initiatives that should be taken in order to improve, to make the system more effective as it is right now. And therefore, I would say that concentrating just on focusing on just on several items will not help anyway. FIU is definitely not the only bottleneck, but what is FIU doing and how FIU can help everybody is we are between private and public sector. And that is our main role, to connect all the dots there. And that is something that we have done. And I myself, while I joined FIU, that was one of the first tasks really to put on track, so to say, PPP or public-private partnership model. So we called together the biggest banks, and afterwards, next year, we called together also other private sector representatives from DNFBB sector as well. And we are very intensively sharing not only strategic information, for example, like for NRA purposes, but we are having very operational type public-private partnerships. So the police, prosecutors, banks, or lawyers, like I will have another PPP meeting today with one of the biggest law firms here in Latvia. We are sharing very, very operational, so to say, tactical information in order to get things done. Because what is the main purpose of AML system? It's not about the compliance and just prevention, which is very many concentrating right now. It is about the catching criminals. We need to get criminals into the prison, or at least confiscate their monies. And that is something that has been done by us, by FIU, to really to call together and to coordinate public and private initiative, so that not only we are exchanging information, sharing some data, but we are also exchanging and making improvements into the cultural change, so that private sector understands what is the issue, or what are the issues of public sector, how they are dealing with problems to really to prove that there is a criminal offense happening. And public sector, police, FIU people, I don't know, prosecutors may understand what kind of issues and difficulties are there for a private sector to really to understand how to prevent criminals abusing the banking system or any other system. This is one thing. Just from statistical point of view, 170 meetings last year of public-private partnership, this model, which we have 71 of them on operational issues. So we exchanged the operational information that afterwards went to the police already in a very nice product dissemination from FIU. And this, of course, also led to the freezing of funds, because FIU Latvia has improved significantly its ability to freeze the funds, which means that we can block transactions or freeze the funds that that criminals wanted to funnel through banking sector. And just again, from statistical point of view, if in 2017, FIU Latvia has frozen 46 millions, then last year it was very close to 500 millions. And this all went as disseminations to the police, and police was able, because they are also exchanging very intensively information with them, they were able to seize or arrest even more than those funds that we informed them about. This is very important. Another very important thing is CEPS report was concentrating on unifying or somehow consolidating SDR reports. I think it is very important, but it is not just about the form, but about the substance. What kind of information you will include in that report. It is good if we know and remember that there is this UNODC tool, GoAML, which is implemented already in 11 member states of EU, which allows us already at this stage say that 1/3 of all EU countries has implemented some type of consolidated SDR form. But this is not just, as I said, about the form, it is about the value that you bring to the SDR. And this is very much about the feedback, definitely. The feedback should be given to the from police to FIU, then to FIU to the private sector. And if this collaboration and exchange of information will not exist, we will never understand what kind of information is there, and vice versa. If private sector notices that there is some new threats arising, like in COVID, we all have faced very intense cyber criminality and cyber fraud. It's again something that private sector, having this platform of exchange of information, can share that data, that information. I think that I can stop. I can talk for hours, but
that's okay, Ilse. Thank you. That was already very insightful.
Yeah, but it's very, very important to my understanding is that we have one very clearly indicated and well-established leadership here in one country or jurisdiction, and then again it compiles together the EU leadership. There should be one institution, authority, that is responsible, that is having this dedicated power of responsibilities for whole sector. I'm not speaking about just the banking sector, I'm not speaking about non-financial sector, or for police, or for anybody. Why I'm saying this? Because we requested, when I came to the position, I said to my officials that are responsible for drafting the legislation for politicians, that FIU is ready to take up that role of being a leader for the AML CFT system here. Of course, we understand that being a leader means also having a responsibility and really to be, to kind of like, if something will go wrong, I know that this will be me who will be responsible for one or another issue. However, if we are talking about only supervisors, then we are not covering whole kind of like perspective. We are not covering all that should be there. And why FIU as the leader has proven to be effective. There is not only public-private partnership platform where we share information. FIU is also leading supervisors platform that comes together all supervisors, financial, non-financial sector supervisors, and they exchange the best practices. They exchange their difficulties. They exchange information, and we bring them back, give them back feedback, what we see from the SDRs that are incoming to us. We are also coordinating different activities for coordination on policy level and bring that information to politicians. Okay. So within that cooperative and collaborative atmosphere, we really were able to understand what are the main issues, what kind of problem solutions we should provide. And that allowed us not only to get out of the gray list, but to continue the reforms that we initiated 3 years ago. So from that perspective, I really appreciate that there is such an initiative on EU level. I really thankful for CEPS for this very brilliant report, which is wrong in relation to what is a bottleneck. But however, we should continue our discussion, and thank you for inviting me here.
Yeah, thank you, Ilse. And I said I will pass on to Richard now, but we have James to speak about it from a technology provider perspective, but James was also active in the financial sector before. But Richard, I pass it on to you now.
Yes, thanks, Carol. But you know, the way that we're going through this, I think probably the best thing to do is to pass it on to James. That might seem like a quick cop out, throwing the baton over, but I think it's very important to get the technological issues or views brought into this. And of course, Google's experience and expertise will be very useful for that. And then what I propose to do is to open up the floor. We've already got some questions coming in. For those of you who are thinking about asking a question, please don't think about it. Please put it in the Q&A and we'll try and get through those. And then I've got a whole feast of questions myself, which we can bounce around as well. So we've certainly got enough to be going on with. James, over to you.
Sure, and thanks for the invite. It's a real pleasure for us to be here on behalf of Google. So yeah, obviously my name is James. I work as part of Google Cloud. Prior to joining Google Cloud a few years ago, I worked at Citi, so I have a background in financial markets. And you might be thinking, you know, why is Google here? Why is Google interested as a cloud provider? And I think this is an important point to sort of highlight, is that cloud is moved beyond just providing computers and storage for companies to use. And especially at Google, we think a lot about how can we provide value-added services that build on some of our capabilities as a technology and ML company first, in addition to partnering closely with some of our biggest customers, which include some of the larger European banks and American banks. And so with that in mind, we have been working towards an AML product or solution, which is one of the first solutions that we're building in the financial services area, with the goal to help customers generate insights on data, to help identify the risks that they face in the context of AML, and then take appropriate action. And we are doing this in the context of what's already available to a bank today. So whilst there has been some criticism from various speakers, including the banks themselves, of the existing processes in place that are labor intensive and time consuming and expensive, but of course there are good things in place as well. And so it's important to be respectful when new technology is produced, to be able to implement what is a working system and make sure that it's not just a bolt-on. So we've been spending some time doing this, and I think, from our perspective, a lot of the points that were raised here so far have really resonated with me. So from the fact that there are so many transactions, even within HSBC, mentioning just the number that they are dealing with, all the way through to globally. And yet, when you look at the number of people tackling this problem, HSBC, Mark mentioned that there was hundreds of people on the technology side, but thousands of people receiving the output of those alerts to deal with them. And I would argue, is that balance correct if we're going to try and scale this out better? And I think cloud can help make this more accessible for some of the smaller banks who perhaps don't have the budget to do this at scale. And so that's where I think technology can play a really important role. But to the challenges that have been highlighted specifically around sharing of data, as a technology company coming into this, working in partnership with banks, I would agree with some of these comments that have been made. And I would say, when we're building the solution, the AML solution, we do not use any SARs. Just sort of get that out there straight away. And the data belongs to the bank. It's not Google's data. So we can only do this with customers. We do not have unfettered access to customers' data. And sometimes they get asked that question. So I wanted to get that out quickly as well. So standards for sharing data across financial institutions' lines of business, their geographical regions, so that it isn't siloed. And, we see siloed data, not just in AML related challenges, across all large companies of all shapes and sizes outside of finance as well. So solving for some of that will make a massive difference. But then the ability to share data among financial institutions for the purposes of AML and financial crime detection before even an SAR is filed would make an interesting difference. And I think that data sharing and aggregation with other countries for this purpose is also important. And so whilst Google cannot be in a role to share customers' data, obviously it's their data, as a cloud provider, where you only pay for what you store, and we can provide guarantees around data residency and in which countries that data is stored in, we feel that we're very well positioned to help provide the ability to store this data and then safely and securely share that data if indeed that is the outcome that people are striving to aim for. We're in a very good position to facilitate that. And then when you bring on the fact that as an ML company with our ML expertise that we've been experts in since probably 2013, most of Google sort of went towards ML as opposed to rule-based approaches to things ranging from language translation to others. We're in a very good position to share that expertise. So that's our sort of view on some of this. And I would say that from a product perspective, it's early days, but we do feel like we're making a positive impact, and that the AI approaches to this are more flexible than some of the rule-based processes, which have been grown through time and are by definition somewhat brittle because they're rules and they need to be maintained in that way. And then lastly, one of the benefits that you get through modern approaches to AI, especially in this context, is the ability to perform explainability, meaning you don't just have a black box algorithm that is saying this is potentially, money laundering or this isn't, you get with that prediction, the most salient reason or reasons as to why that is indeed the case, which can then help focus the human resource or person or individual who's on the receiving end of that recommendation or alert. And to the point of, the number of false positives and the amount of staff performing manual activities, those two things are intrinsically linked. And so even small improvements in dealing with false positives and getting that number to be more respectable and improved will have a very large knock-on impact onto the number of people that are performing manual tasks, which of course are open to human error. And those manual tasks, those resources can be freed up and reinvested into making the technology better and creating a virtuous cycle. We don't see AML being solved by AI where there's no human in the loop anytime soon. That's not what I'm suggesting, but a balance towards making the technology better and creating that virtuous cycle so that even new money laundering techniques are caught before we need to go and build brittle rules to catch them after the fact. This is the aim and the goal that we're progressing for, and where I think technology and cloud providers in particular, obviously I'm biased at Google, can play a key role.
Great, thanks very much indeed, James. That's a fascinating one. And yeah, my first thing was on the AI sort of stuff that you mentioned, having given a talk earlier last week on the development of AI systems by the criminals to defeat AI developed by us, gives me a quick opening question just to sort of follow on from that. Is where do you see the AI space going in that respect? Because I was quite surprised that there doesn't seem to be very much in the way of any legislation on AI. Nobody's really looking at AI development in that respect. All that we've really got so far, it seems, is a series of recommendations coming out of the high-level experts group in the European Commission, where you're looking at 7 sort of key principles of development of AI, but that has yet to be sort of implanted into any other systems. And you look at AI being used by law enforcement, and some of that is really contentious, like facial recognition, for example. The boundary with human rights and so on. Do you want to offer a quick sort of comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot in there, so I'll try and unpack it as you went. So the first thing I'll mention, is that at Google, we are one of those companies that want to use AI for good. And we have our own AI principles that we publish externally. And I would encourage all companies and organizations to be thinking and doing the same. However, criminals clearly are not following good AI principles on how AI should be used. So with that in mind, I think that the fact that some criminals are dumb, as was mentioned earlier, is inevitably true. And as is the case, that some criminals, when there's a lot of money at stake, are going to be very smart and are going to be paying a lot of money to try and circumvent these processes because it's in their interest and it's business for them, right? And so I would argue that if an AI or machine learning approach to circumventing existing AML rules is already being exploited and used by criminals, one of the only ways to keep up with that is through the role of technology, clearly. I don't think that can be kept up with through human capital. And I also think that the ways things were working in the past will not necessarily work in the future. And what better way to tackle that with AI itself, which is known for being able to quickly adapt to new scenarios and spot general new ways of doing things that are not normal. And so I would argue that it is a perfect use case to tackle AI with AI. And in fact, in the field of machine learning, that is indeed a thing called generative, well, it doesn't matter. There's a technical thing in AI where that's a whole field into itself. So that is our position. And with respect to our conversations with regulators, we do regularly talk to European and global regulators about AI to help educate on our view, to help them form an opinion. And we're very active in this space, and myself personally have been involved in some of those conversations. And I think that there is still work to be done But of course, criminals will not respect any of those decisions that any regulators make or whatever. So we do need to have a commensurate response where AI can be used for good, safely and appropriately.
Yes, we're very much involved in an arms race, it seems to me. So you know, you invent a way to sort of try and stop the criminals getting in. So you focus on passwords. The criminals develop password scrappers. You invent captures. Then you know there's some AI stuff to get past the capture systems. You have systems to take clients on board, and you have criminal AI looking at the account opening procedures and developing ways so you can sneak in unnoticed and get signed off. So yeah, all a bit of an issue really. But anyway, I really wanted to make sure that we address the questions which are coming in, because I think that's only fair. So first of all, I have a question for Mark. This questioner is saying that you mentioned the benefit of shared utilities and combining the efforts of private sector actors to monitor transactions. Has HSBC engaged in such initiatives? And if so, what are the challenges you've faced in doing so?
So the short answer is not in the transaction monitoring space. We are engaged with a consortium of banks on the name screening. So that's the use of technology to screen our customers as opposed to monitor them, which is in most jurisdictions also a legislative obligation. So we have got a consortium looking at that with a number of other banks of tier 1 and 2 sizes. That will start moving through, I think, the remaining part of this year, and hopefully get some traction. We've looked at, with some of our partners, our peer partners, the potential for monitoring. And I know some of them have engaged already in Europe, which is helpful. We haven't, and we will continue observing that and looking for ways that we can. It would be very beneficial for us, obviously, because the barriers are there. Yes, between data sharing, and we've spoken about that, and also the practical barriers of commercial competitors getting together and actually collaborating to do something involving customers. Is a bit tricky, and there are various levels of that, but the benefits would be quite helpful, because you know we get to see a very narrow view of the customer's activity, and if they're transacting across multiple banks through multiple jurisdictions, which most customers are, particularly the criminal customers, then it is we only get to see a very small portion of that, whereas a utility service, as well as being able to share the costs and leverage the technology that James is talking about, gets to see quite a bit more of the customer transaction flows, which ultimately is what it's all about.
Great, thanks so much indeed, Mark. I've got a question for Ilse, and this is, are there legal obstacles to exchanging operational and tactical data within PPPs, which you've managed to overcome?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think that the GDPR experts most probably will have some, or might have some other opinions, but yes, when we established PPP platform in our law, the GDPR issue was assessed, and basically we are right now certain that we are not anyhow not compliant with GDPR rules, as we are sharing only that personal data for that is meant for investigative purposes, and that is expressly permitted. We are requesting officially information from the banks after we have had meetings with them and law enforcement. And when law enforcement already acknowledged that they are interested in that information that will be shared by the banks or any other private sector representatives, from that perspective, I think that as GDPR does not kind of like covering investigative purposes, we are compliant, and we are suggesting that model to other European countries as well.
Great, thanks Ilse. And I think it was quite interesting, because this area came up on our task force, and we did have a session with representatives from the data protection sort of side who came in and talked to us about those kinds of issues. We had a case many years ago in the UK where our data protection regulator had turned around and said, yes, it's a right of anybody who's mentioned in the suspicious activity reports to see what information has been put in that report. And you know, if you're reporting on criminals, all of a sudden it's sort of shock horror. I'm not going to bother reporting then if you're not going to protect me as the whistleblower. But of course, the other aspects of that also is not just the GDPR and the application within the EU, because you know an awful lot of these money laundering, organised crime sort of syndicates operating outside the EU as well, and that's one of the techniques that I've certainly seen a lot of. Is that, you know, if you want to make the trail harder to obfuscate, then you do make sure that the transactions go through as many different sort of countries speaking different languages with different cultures and even different alphabets. So, you know, it's not just Cyrillic, it's some of the other weird and wonderful alphabets. So, so how do you cope with information sharing between EU and non-EU?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was raising hands because I really was eager to answer this question, and I also want to kind of like make sure that we have very detailed rules in our legislation that prevents us or prevents any criminal or any private person basically to request information from FIU, whether there was some STR coming in, and from that perspective, we are protecting our information sources, including those who provide us STRs. But from the perspective of how we deal with the information sharing between different countries, not only EU countries, I also wanted to kind of like put on the table for discussion that clearly also somehow resonates with the conclusions in the report. How FIUs are trying to really to bring to a slightly upper level its cooperation between themselves. So from the perspective of the bank that I already indicated, it was the ABLV bank. We understood that this is such a large scale potential money laundering case, and I'm saying potential just because this is still under the prosecutors and investigators kind of like reach, and there's no any final judgment on what bank has done. But we understood that there needs to be more effective mechanism of sharing information with at least between FIUs, but we have managed to expand that platform, and I would be very happy to explain that in 2019, FIU Latvia organized the platform for 25 FIUs worldwide, and this is not about EU, it is about also those victim countries, which basically from where the money came and to where money went, and we organized that platform of 25 countries. We call that platform IFIT, or International Financial Intelligence Task Force, and that platform, that composition, our body of 25 FIUs that are most impacted by the inflows, outflows, is coordinated by us, by me, myself, and we are coming together every 3-4 months, sometimes half a year because of COVID, definitely, and we share information on practical level, on tactical, on operational level, which involves those money flows, international money flows. Why I think that this is very that model should be put as the example, and already on some African countries have shared that or started to use that model, is because we were able to expand that to the supervisors. Some supervisors are also complementing us with information, and moreover, there are last December we met already with the law enforcement that wants to kind of like bring wants to be involved in that information sharing platform. So from that perspective, it's again comes back or boils down to collaboration. And I think that if we will be able to really to manage such a big network of information sharing bodies, then it will be also more easily for the private sector to share information on the group level if it not involves just the EU-based banks. So from that perspective, we need to overcome that obstacle that relates to the information sharing. Definitely, that is one of our tasks.
Okay, brilliant. I've got a question here which says addressed to any of the speakers, but I think it's probably most appropriate for Carolyn. Carolyn, while the banks are massively investing in advanced automated transaction monitoring systems, are the EU supervisory authorities able to assess the effectiveness of an automated transaction monitoring system? So, you know, we've got two representatives here who are operating transaction monitoring systems. Should there be a standard on what those transaction monitoring systems cover and what their capability should be?
Thanks, Richard. I think that's a really relevant question. And I think what we've seen is that some supervisors are better equipped than others to actually test effectiveness. And the reason why it's really important that supervisors do this or have the ability to test. I can hear some sort of noise. I don't know where it's coming from. Is that okay? I just continue speaking. So essentially, it depends very much on the impact of supervisors being unable to test effectiveness. Is that on the one hand, of course, transaction monitoring systems that don't do their job are being employed. So that's not what we want. That's not the space we want to be in. But the other risk is that financial institutions may be hesitant to take up more innovative solutions to transaction monitoring for fear that the supervisor might not endorse it or might have issues with that. So what we are currently doing at the level of the EU is that we work with competent authorities to facilitate the exchange of information and best practice, to really increase the knowledge base and to give everyone the confidence to understand what it is that they're looking for when testing whether those systems and controls are effective. And we also do a lot of monitoring ourselves to understand what's currently out there in the market and what the impact is from an AML CFT perspective. So it's something that's I admit is a huge challenge for many supervisors, because it requires, like many things in the AML regime at the moment, it requires a sea change, and it requires a different skill set from that which we have traditionally seen. And there are some interesting approaches out there. And I think that the challenge for us and the challenge for national competent authorities will be to roll that out more broadly across the EU, to make sure that we've got a consistent and consistently effective approach to supervising financial institutions that employ those systems. And I think one of the key points here is that it's going to be really important for supervisors and industry and providers of those solutions to exchange regularly, so that everyone is up to speed and knows what the expectations are.
Great. Okay, I've got another question here, which I think is probably for our bankers. What are the biggest issues identified with respect to SARs, STRs reported by financial institutions? We've got some, before I let Mark and Matthew loose on that answer, we've got about 10 minutes left, so we can just make our answers quite quick. That'd be great.
Well, I'll let Matthew kick off.
I mean, there's so many different typologies we are tending to look at now. There's a lot going on, fraud, for example, linked to COVID in the recent time. Let me just say, if I can go off the question a second, just to say I'm actually very encouraged by the discussion on collaboration and information sharing. I'd just like to say a word on that I really appreciate hearing from Carolyn this sort of systematic way thinking through the different types of information sharing and how to unlock that. I really think we need that. And you put your finger on the GDPR as one of them. We have the biggest debates between our GDPR lawyers and our financial crime lawyers about what to do in situations. We got stuck on one, which is if you have an adverse media alert, okay, on Mr. Elderfield, are you allowed to hold on to that adverse media alert, or do you have to delete it immediately? The financial crime guys want to hold on to it so they can see next time they look that data, people are like, oh, no, you couldn't possibly do that. And then the Danish interpretation is a bit different than the Swedish and the Finnish. So it's a very complex area. But that said, I'm super encouraged by what I heard from Ilse that she's doing with all these public-private partnerships, and which Sweden's doing as well, which is you can already navigate to a certain extent. You can have the operational conversations that Ilse talked about. We have the opportunity to get started on that now. For example, the FIU, if you put a framework around it, can give you names to investigate, names of customers. We can't talk to the other banks. That's a problem. We can work on typologies. So there is an ability to be more operationally effective. Let's do the work that Carolyn's talked about, bring down some of those barriers, but having collaboration front and center, I think, is absolutely right.
I'll just be very quick, Richard. The problem that I see across the different spans is consistency. What's expected between one regime or one country or one market and another is quite different. And I could just name 5 countries in Europe alone where there is a marked difference between what we have to report as a suspect matter to their neighbours even. So you can literally move 20 kilometres across the border and you have a different reporting regime in place. Magnify that by 50, 60, 70 jurisdictions globally, it becomes quite tricky, particularly when you're dealing with international customers and whether they have committed an indictable offence in one market or one country versus another. It's a subject for much debate and discussion within the group, as it should be. And Matthew mentioned the sharing business. Yeah, the issue with sharing is interesting, and part of the reason this tipping off legislation or the tipping off recommendations came into place was banks were seen and are still now regarded to a large extent as part of the problem, and the ability to trust the various players within the chain of events that leads to a SAR, which is why the tipping off legislation has been quite tight. I think that's going to relax over the next 5 to 10 years, but you need to earn your position at the table of trust for that to happen. So that being able to share between private sector entities, but also across jurisdictions, is something that we've gradually been working away. And as the financial sector, the private sector, gains more trust and demonstrates that it's capable of doing some of these things more effectively, I think we'll see that legislation ease off and the ability to share those STRs and SARs broadening.
Great, thanks. So I've got one which has come in, which looks like it's more for James, I guess. How can we improve the interaction between developers of RegTech solutions on transaction monitoring, supervisors and the financial industry to advance on the use of effective RegTech solutions?
Oof, that's a good question. So I mean, this links to a lot of the discussion that we've been having around sharing data. I mean, I think that sharing data is an important part of it, but I also think this links to the standards and it links to general communication abilities between these organizations. And I think if you're an outsider from a bank building a product, and you wish to gain access to sensitive information, you need to be iterating and trying new things. Of course, there needs to be a framework to support innovation, but at the same time, it can't be a framework that just lets anyone come in and gain access to information that they shouldn't have in case they're not responsible with it. So for me, I think there is a role for the banks themselves to play here. I think there is a role for regulators to play to create regulation that can facilitate innovation in this space. And, Google and companies like us as well, the big techs would benefit in addition, right, as well as the smaller players, to create a sort of ability, and Richard, this links back to our other point, if the criminals are employing more advanced technology quicker because they don't have to abide by any other rules, then it's easier for them to make progress in some ways. Whereas, if fintechs and regtechs and big techs are trying to keep up with technology, but there isn't the framework in place to give them the guidance on how to progress, then of course people err on the side of caution, and that can inadvertently stifle innovation in a way that it's not intended to. So for me, we all have a role to play in improving the dialogue and communication here. But practically, if you are a smaller company looking to provide solutions in this space, you have to find a partner that's going to work with you. And potentially, I guess, one way to help with that is have them invest into you early on, for example.
Great, thanks, James. I've got another question from Matthew, which has come in. And the questioner is saying, you mentioned, if it's been understood correctly, that in Europe only around 1% of the money spent by the banks for AML monitoring is confiscated, and the system is working quite poorly. The estimation by Europol of the suspicious transactions annually is hundreds of billions of euros. So what kinds of targets are there within the financial industry, if any, or financial sector, to, and this is put, confiscate assets in the future? Obviously, confiscation is carried out by sort of prosecution elements, but of course, when we're looking at monies, particularly when we're looking at fraud cases, then quite often law enforcement will just turn that back to private sector, and private sector say, well, you know, you go and get your monies back. You've got the legal ability to go and launch various actions against you, and then of course we end up with, well, I've really got all the information that I need, and quite a bit of the information is held by the law enforcement and not able to be shared with private sector for me to conduct my case and get the monies back, which I've been defrauded of. So what kinds of targets do you think we ought to have, Matthew?
Yeah, I think, you know, one of the things that struck me in the CEPS paper was about how this is a very data light area in the public policy arena, and the lack of clear KRIs, KPIs. I thought that was a very thoughtful point. And I mean, you have answered the question, as did Ilse earlier, is that confiscation is actually at the end of the pipeline for the prosecution authorities. And it's very sparse data on confiscation. It tends to be like 4 or 5 years old. I think having more rigorous KRIs and KPIs would make sense, but let's be focused on the risk, and let's be focused on trying to get the criminals. We have a lot of KRIs, but we tend to be focused on the compliance with the rules. I'll come to that, aren't necessarily the same thing. So we have KRIs about, are we doing our SARs fast enough? Are we getting through our alerts quickly enough? Are we being systematic in our typologies? Which I think is all good. But the emphasis from the compliance side of the house, if you like, tends to be do more faster, which I fear, Ilse is more the expert than me, just tends to flood the FIUs, not always with good quality SARs. And this is maybe a kind of a point that ideally you want risk management and compliance to go hand in hand. But I think in financial crime, you have risk management and compliance have diverged. And that the way the rule book works has value in it, but the way it's been interpreted is actually encouraging to do more and more less value activities, which you're spending a lot of money on, where you could have higher value doing collaborative, intelligence-led activities, targeted. And then you could say, let's set targets for the FIUs, the banks, and the public prosecutors for 1 quarter. How many SARs do you get on human trafficking? What about seized assets for human trafficking in that period? What about arrests for that? And you could have something more targeted and specific. So having more thoughtful, data-driven approach, I think, makes sense. But let's focus on the risk and the goal, getting the financial criminals, rather than just generating more compliance tick boxes.
Great, thanks very much. Yeah, I think we're coming sort of towards the end of our time. So I'm going to give one sort of wrap-up question for each of our speakers today, and they'll have a little bit of time to think about it, because I think we'll ask another question in the interim. But the question will be, if there's one thing that you would say is going to be the best step to improve effectiveness of AML, and I mentioned emphasize effectiveness, not efficiency, because I think a lot of organizations, I see that they start developing key performance indicators, and of course if you haven't got the objectives and the key results right, then all the key performance indicators do is to accelerate the wrong answer, which is not what we're trying to achieve. So if everybody can think about their one key thing that they'd like to see change for effectiveness, that'd be great. And then I'll go to another question which is coming from the audience. So this one is existing AML transaction. Oh, hang on, sorry. Do you think that the collaboration between finance companies and FIUs is working well in most European countries? And allied to that is a sub-question: why is it that in countries that promote tax avoidance, don't actually see anybody doing that, but I see what you're getting at. The functioning of FIUs is so poor. That seems to be directed more towards the offshore sort of financial centres, which quite often have rather low or no tax rates in certain respects. So who's going to take the collaboration one? It's probably Ilse, I guess.
Yeah, I was so much involved in your question on what would be the one thing. So I on collaboration, but of course I can answer this. I think that, of course, I can agree that there is a diversity between different collaboration models within Europe, and there's FIUs that I definitely know that they are collaborating, and there are some and some of them are unfortunately in very large countries or large jurisdictions, and therefore basically impacting the understanding of the different actors on how effective are FIUs there. And those FIUs that are not so much into the collaboration, of course, they are put kind of like, or faced with the issue that very many private sector representatives are requesting this collaboration just for the reasons Matthew explained to us already. And as from my perspective, personal understanding of what is the main answer to the single answer right now to the effectiveness or improvement of effectiveness is this collaboration. So from that perspective, I think that one of the main goals for me, myself, and my FIU is that we need to promote this culture of collaboration. And within those countries which still have this historical kind of like legacy type view on how to fight financial crime, we need to bring more that kind of like information, how successful it could be, not only on an operational level, but also on the issues that Matthew described when it comes to the how effectively STR can be improved. And I just from statistical point of view, in 2017 there were 17,000 STRs coming into FIU Latvia. We changed the system, and right now we have a little bit less than 5,000 STRs just in basically 3 years. And what is very important, that out of those 17,000 STRs, only 10% were put on the index analysis. Right now, 89% of all STRs. And what it means basically that not only we can provide better information to the or feedback to the private sector, it's also relates to the better understanding of typologies, national or regional typologies. But also it means that we can disseminate more effectively and the information that can be transferred already in very effective document for investigation purposes and prosecutors purposes. But on the second part of the question, I think it would be very not nice from my side to really kind of like comment on one or another issue. But if I may say, from the perspective of on EU level, there are certain countries that has been regarded as having more aggressive tax policies. I would say those countries that has been regarded as such, having this aggressive tax policy, from my perspective, are very well cooperating. They are exchanging information, and that is not so as we historically would think so. But what is important then, if I, as proud as I am on everything that we have done in relation to the international financial flows, on having kind of like on analyzing how Latvia's status of regional financial center influenced our money laundering investigations, I am not so proud of how effective we are on disseminating in relation to tax crime. And why it's so? I think it's because it still lacks willingness from politicians, from governments, and from businesses to really fight tax crimes. And I'm saying that because I'm coming from the consultancy kind of like sector where the tax planning was kind of like a part of the business. It is still very, very far from being effective. We are still not exchanging enough information. We are still allowing ourselves to kind of like cheat a bit for tax purposes, to say to very many people that aggressive tax planning is something that should be kind of like, sometimes it's even beneficial. This is about cultural change. So that would be.
Absolutely, thank you. Right, I think we probably better wind up now. So I'm getting my magic wand out, and I'm giving you the opportunity to say which is the one top thing that you would like to have to be able to improve effectiveness of AML around Europe or within your organization or for the world, if you want to go a bit further than that. And you can have anything on that. So if you want to say that get rid of transaction monitoring altogether, you know, billions spent, no return, feel free. Let's start with Matthew.
Thanks. First of all, what an awesome statistic from Ilse to say you go from 17,000 STRs, you only investigate 10%, you cut it down to 5,000, you investigate 89%. That's the wave of the future, and we should have more focus like that. That's my favorite statistic from today, I'd say. For me, it's simple. It's improved collaboration through better culture and reduced barriers to information sharing.
Great, Mark.
Yeah, for me, it's also simple. It's just intelligence. We've got all the other pieces of the puzzle in place, and we're getting better at them. But in terms of bang for buck, the more intelligence I get as a financial institution, the better precision I'm able to target on criminal activities that go through the bank.
Great, Carolyn.
Okay, since we covered cooperation and intelligence already, I will say cultural change and a move away from a focus on pure compliance towards a more risk-based approach that allows us to focus on the real risks and the real issue and target resources accordingly. Because unfortunately, I think to this day in Europe, we still got very much a focus on ticking boxes. And the key to effectiveness, and my view is to make sure not only that we've got systems and controls in place, or as a supervisor that you check that they're in place, but actually that they are fit for purpose and that they work. And I leave it at that.
Brilliant. Ilse, quick one.
Famous auditors saying substance over form. I think I can understand what Carolyn was saying, that definitely we should more concentrate on not so much on compliance or tick the box example, but we should really catch the criminals and be very timely and collaborative between ourselves.
And last but by no means least, James.
So I +1 on all of the suggestions ranging from data sharing to culture. Perhaps I'll go down the line of clearer sort of uniform regulation about how banks and service providers can test and implement and have regulators approve AI systems and other new technologies for banks to use. That could be very helpful making the AI better.
Excellent. Well, yeah, I think Carol might have been coming back on, or he mentioned he might, but he looks like he might have been kidnapped by something, or he's gone off to submit a suspicious transaction report, or seen some suspicious activity of some description. But anyway, it's I think I'd better wind it up now because we're a little bit over time already. First of all, thank you very much to all of you for attending. I hope you found that useful. We've gone through, I think I've managed to get through virtually all the questions, but there's probably some that you're still sitting on. If you're still sitting on them, please do get in touch with us at CEPS and send them in. We will endeavour to get those answered. Please also watch the CEPS space on this, because there are so many elements in the task force report that the intention is to pick a different sort of area of that, and then have a few more webinars like this, which we hope will help you in a practical sense as well. So with that, and I have a whole feast of questions here, which I've got ready just in case we didn't get any from the audience, which we still haven't got into. And as you can see, we could probably talk about this for several days. But thank you very, very much indeed. And thank you very much to all our speakers from all our different countries for your invaluable insights and for sharing them with us as well. I know it's a fascinating area and something which we desperately need to do something about, because we've ended up with pretty much compliance for compliance sake, and we seem to have lost sight of all the people who are dying from drug overdoses, people who are suffering through terrorist financing and other kinds of things, the masses of corruption going on, not just outside Europe but within Europe, and particularly in the pandemic era, where we've seen tons of corruption going on in relation to supply of PPE, false claims about vaccines and so on and so forth. So still plenty to do, and lots to think about. And if you've got any ideas for where you'd like to see this going in the future, we're probably going to set up another task force looking at specific parts of AML. We're just trying to decide which areas to do that in. So stay in touch, have a great day, and thank you once again for joining us. Thank you very much.